Ja, gut. Guten Abend. Dann herzlich willkommen im kleinen Kreis zu einem Vortrag, auf den ich mich persönlich sehr, sehr freue. Herzlich willkommen, Nadia Radwan aus Bern. Und es geht darum, dass wir uns bei der Ausstellung Liberté gesehen haben, dass es einige ganz interessante Frauen gibt, die da plötzlich mitmischen, was gar nicht selbstverständlich ist zu der Zeit. Und da ist eben Inji Efflatoun eine davon, da ist Ami Nimre eine davon. Und wir waren dann ganz erfreut, als uns Sam Bardawil und Till Fellrath, die beiden Kuratoren der Ausstellung, auf Nadia Radwans Forschungen aufmerksam machten. Und Nadia Radwan ist eben an der Universität in Bern und unterrichtet dort nicht-westliche Kunstgeschichte der Moderne. Und sie hat an verschiedenen anderen Stellen auch unterrichtet. Vorhin hat sie mir erzählt, in Dubai war sie auch für ein Jahr und hat dort aber dann westliche moderne Kunstgeschichte unterrichtet. Und ist jetzt eben an der Universität in Bern, hat gerade ein Buch über die ägyptische Moderne veröffentlicht. Das ist gerade ganz frisch letzte Woche erst erschienen und hat eben auch über Inji Efflatoun geforscht, hat auch sich beteiligt an einer Ausstellung, die Inji Efflatoun hatte, im Mataf, diesem einzigen Museum für moderne arabische Kunst in der arabischen Welt, was sich in Doha in Katar befindet. Ja, jetzt freue ich mich sehr, and I switch into English a little bit, but I think you understand my introduction words, and I'm really very happy that you came here. And we are very much looking forward to hear something about the women in the Liberté context, and especially on Inji Efflatoun. Thank you very much, Nadia.
Thanks a lot for the introduction. Of course, I understand German perfectly. It's just that it's not good enough for me to give a nice presentation, but you're most welcome at the end to ask your questions in German. First of all, I'd like to thank Doris Christoph for welcoming me here. I'm very happy, actually, to have the opportunity to talk in the framework of the Art and Liberty exhibition. So today I'm going to talk about the women in the Art and Liberty group, focusing on the artist Inji Efflatoun as an emblematic example of a generation of Egyptian women intellectuals. And I'd like to reframe her work a little bit in the broader context of Egyptian modern art, in which groups such as the Surrealists emerged during the first half of the 20th century. So although she belonged, and other women I'm going to mention, belonged for a while to the Surrealist group, we're going to show other of her works which are not directly linked to the group. So Inji Efflatoun was, what I would like to show is that she wasn't a marginal. She was really an intellectual of her time, or what one may have called then in Egypt a new woman. That is to say, a woman who not only testified to the social and political transformations of Egyptian society, but also, in many ways, one who initiated that change. So, as a political activist and an accomplished artist born into the Cairene elite, her life and work are really representative of the emancipation of a generation of Egyptian women that was formulated as early on in Egypt, and sometimes one tends to forget that, as early on as 1900 by some Egyptian reformists, including Qasim Amin, in his very famous book Al-Mara al-Jadida, published in 1900, which means the new woman. So, indeed, modernizers in Egypt, as actually elsewhere in the world, took up the notion of the new woman as a focal point for perceived change in society. And during the 40s, this woman became the epitome of a new generation, reflected again by the title of this review, La Femme Nouvelle, published in Cairo, founded by one of Efflatoun's contemporaries, the feminist leader, poet, and writer Doria Shafik. And you can see here one of the a photographic portrait of Doria Shafik by quite renowned photographer at that time, established in Cairo, Van Leo. So Inji Efflatoun embodies this new woman in the sense that she was part of an intelligentsia that paved the way to a reflection about social justice, women's rights, and also the role art could play in their accomplishments. Although actually quite a few exhibitions have been dedicated to Inji Efflatoun, her works were shown, and Doris was mentioning to me that this is where she actually discovered the artist at the Venice Biennale in 2015. They were later shown also in Cairo in a renowned gallery called the Safar Khan Gallery, and also at the Mathaf Arab Museum of Modern Art in Doha in 2016. And despite the fact that there were several exhibitions dedicated to this artist, academic research regarding her life and work was until recently relatively scarce. So now there are several scholars working on Egyptian modern art and also working on women in Egyptian modern art. And I do have to mention here the work of two of my colleagues, Anneka Lenson in the United States and Nadine Atalla in Paris. Here you see the book cover of the recent edition of Inji Efflatoun's memoirs, which have been published, and which are entitled From Childhood to Prison. And reading those memoirs shows that whether in her artistic practice or in her political commitment, she engaged with a diversity of vocabularies by interweaving her cosmopolitan background with her multiple Egyptian identities. She was actually constantly oscillating between the elite, to which she belonged, and the working class with which she sought to relate. And this Egyptian working class is clearly one of a very important focus in several of her paintings, as are also the popular neighborhoods of Cairo, as you can see here in this cafe. It's popular cafe, as there are thousands in Islamic Cairo. So as many young Egyptians, young privileged Egyptians of her generation, Efflatoun grew up in an environment that was open to European culture. She was raised speaking French, which was very common actually at that time, with her sister, Gulperi Efflatoun, who was also became a prominent writer. And both of them were raised by their mother, Salha Efflatoun, who had married at the age of 14, which also was common at that time, but against which women were fighting since the 20s, trying to make the age of marriage higher. And she divorced at the age of 19. So the mother, Inji's mother, after this divorce, established a fashion and textile business in Cairo in 1936. So you can imagine in Cairo, Egypt, in the 30s, being a divorced single mother was actually quite rare. And Inji Efflatoun admits in her memoirs that she really this brought a lot of admiration in her for her mother. So she was educated. I give you a little bit the background to show you, because she is not an isolated case. One has often said that Inji Efflatoun is an activist, a marginal, but just bear in mind that many women from the elite at that time were raised as such. So she was educated at the Sacré-Cœur in Heliopolis, which is a neighborhood of Cairo, and which was mainly frequented by Christian young girls. And again, in her memoirs, she recalls the strict environment of the school that was meant to educate good wives. And she mentions that the chief nun who sensed the revolt growing in the young girl at the time had warned her mother that she may later be a danger to society. Which, I mean, depending from whose point of view, was actually turned out to be true. So then from the Sacré-Cœur, she went to the Lycée Français in Cairo. And this is where she sort of really found the basis for her freedom of thought, because this is where she could discover and read French philosophy and authors such as Voltaire, Diderot, or Descartes. So really during that time, she developed a strong interest also for art, and as many young Egyptians from the elite, she was assigned a private tutor at home for painting lessons. But of course, those tutors were often, they were European, they often came from very sort of conservative academic backgrounds, and it's really when she met Kamel El-Temissani that a major change sort of occurred in her artistic practice. El-Temissani was a painter and then later a filmmaker. You have actually in the exhibition, and I don't know if it's the entire film or an abstract of his film, The Black Market. He actually played a very important role because prior to the art and liberty movement, he founded another group called the Group of the Neo-Orientalists. And he founded that group in 1937. And that group advocated in its manifest a sort of new, authentic Oriental art, an art that would be freed from the complex, I quote, of being an Oriental and freed from Western academic canons. So the members of this group, they all had in common the rejections of the lessons of the School of Fine Art, taught in the School of Fine Art in Cairo. And they were sort of turning towards the search for local subjects. They also had an inclination for social satire. But most of the group, the Neo-Orientalist group, didn't last for that long, and many of the members actually joined the Surrealists and the Art and Liberty group when it was founded by Georges Hennein in 1938. So when Kamel El-Temissani, who then became actually Inji Efflatoun's teacher, she sort of learned. She painted with him. She followed him to the Surrealist group. So I don't want to probably repeat what you already know, but I'm just showing you this abstract from an article by Georges Hennein of one of his conferences that he gave at the Essayiste in Cairo. In 1939, L'Art dans la Mêlée, an important conference, and also the cover page of the review En Effort, in which Georges Hennein, actually regularly published, and this before even founding the group, the Surrealist group Art et Liberté. And as you probably all know, also, the Art and Liberty group included artists such as Ramses Younan, of whom you here have a drawing entitled À la surface du sable, Fouad Kamel, as well as writers such as Albert Kosseri. Yeah, sorry, I forgot to mention that this was a portrait of the Francophone writer Albert Cosseri, who was also part of the Surrealists. Yeah, Ramses Younan is probably one of the Egyptian surrealists that was, in a sense, formally the closest to the European counterpart of the movement. So, as you know, the group had a clear leftist orientation. It was established on the model of the International Federation of Independent Revolutionary Artists, the FIARI, which was formulated by André Breton and Léon Trotsky in the home of Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera in Mexico. So they were profoundly, the members of the group Art et Liberté were profoundly influenced as the French counterpart by Freudian theories, firmly opposed to fascism, imperialism, and in the specific case of Egypt, they were very much fighting against the feudal agrarian system and were calling upon agrarian reforms. Besides Inji Efflatoun, there was another feminine figure that played a major role in the group, and that was the writer Iqbal El-Aili, which you can see here on the third after Georges Hénin and Fouad Kamel. And she was not only the companion and wife of Georges Hénin, but also the granddaughter of one of Egypt's most prominent poets, Ahmed Shawki, renowned actually up to now in Egypt. We call him the Prince of Poets. Also, Inji's sister, Gulperi, whom I mentioned to you earlier on, was a writer, participated in the activities of the group, as is attested by this photograph of her entitled Surrealist Portrait of Gulperi Efflatoun by Georges Hénin. Inji participated in the independent art exhibitions of the group in 1942 and 1943. So she was really then just a teenager, and maybe one can see this sort of youth yet in those type of paintings. And the paintings from that period are characterized, as you can see, by those dark tones, tormented, let's say tormented figures. Often she would represent feminine figures and sort of surreal, agitated landscapes. This one actually is in the exhibit. I mean, both of those works are in the exhibition. And again, you see one of the examples of Efflatoun's work of that period. Again, with the sort of feminine, tortured feminine figures at the center of the work. But during the 40s, she also painted, she also used the black ink on paper in works that really, as you can see here, in this representation of the church altar, which really echo some of Altel Messani, so her professor at the time, Altel Messani's works. He produced quite a lot of engravings, sort of enigmatic engravings that often represented popular tales. And he illustrated the first novel published by Albert Cosseri, who would only, he was Egyptian, born in Egypt, but he always wrote all his life in French. Les Hommes oubliés de Dieu, published in 1941. So this was illustrated by Telmisani. And one sees that a sort of Inji Efflatoun picked up on that etching style in her inks on paper. So the leftist environment of the Egyptian surrealists led sort of Inji during that period to get interested, to be exposed to Marxist literature. And she admits that Marxism profoundly influenced her, I quote, by its logic and the link between economic and social freedom. So she actually, as I mentioned at the beginning, she was a political activist, and she did join in 1944 the communist organization Iskra. Iskra meaning the torch in Russian, was a communist organization influenced by Marxists, and it's also in Egypt was also referred to as al-Sharara, which also means the torch in Arabic. So when she joined Iskra, which was, of course, a secret organization, she sort of progressively started to break away from her bourgeois past by abandoning the first thing she did was to sort of not abandon, but stop speaking French. So moving away from her French mother tongue to learn Arabic, because her Arabic, although she was born in Egypt, was not that good. So starting to learn Arabic really seriously. She continued, nevertheless, to give art and French classes at the Lycée Français, but expressed herself from then on mostly in Arabic. And she also married a Marxist activist, Hamdi Abdelgawad, who was an attorney and who would later be also imprisoned. So this was, I mean, the 40s, this period when Inji Efflatoun joined the Surrealist movement was in a sense a sort of, I'd say, a short path within her entire career. So I'd like to show you some other works which she produced later on. She did also, late in the 50s, she studied under another, and this is a bit less, one talks a lot about Kamel El-Tilmisani teaching her, but she did study under the Swiss-Austrian artist Margot Veillon, who was born in Cairo, actually, and spent most of her life in Egypt, traveling from time to time to Switzerland. And Veillon had established her studio in Egypt, and she was really a keen observer of traditional customs, local know-how. She was particularly interested in the Egyptian peasant. She almost had this kind of, let's say, ethnographic gaze. She'd take notes, a lot of notes sometimes on many of her paintings, describing what the peasants were doing and so on. And she introduced sort of Inji Efflatoun to capturing, in a sense, the life of the rural world. Just to show you what a painting produced the same year by Inji Efflatoun. I mean, the representing the peasant was totally mainstream at the time. It was part, since the 20s, of a sort of discourse about national identity, anti-colonial. I mean, peasantry is a gigantic subject in the history of modern Egyptian art. But it's just interesting that Efflatoun used this sort of, then she turned away from it, but with Margot Veillon, this sort of picturesque way of almost nostalgic, almost orientalist way of representing the peasant and the Egyptian countryside. So, studying aside two painters such as Telmisani, and Veillon probably, considerably enriched her practice. But however, the fact that she studied first at home with a private tutor and then in the studios of two artists is also due to one very important fact, and I'd like to talk a little bit about this, was the exclusion simply of women from artistic educational institutions. So in a sense, she didn't have much choice because women were not allowed to enter the School of Fine Arts in Cairo, which was actually founded in 1908, so at the very beginning of the century, by a prince and art lover called Youssef Kamal. And so the school was actually exclusively open to men during almost half a century after its foundation. And this is really an important fact. But this didn't stop. There were still many, in parallel, many women artists that were practicing in Egypt, that were exhibiting regularly in galleries, in the Cairo Art Salon, and Inji was part of them. And they did this, until 1952, when under Gamal Abdel Nasser, the school was, a section of the school was open to girls. And Inji actually took some classes in 1952 in the free section of the School of Fine Arts in Cairo. So the fact that women couldn't enter the School of Fine Arts really, didn't stop them in their practice. And as these women also belonged to a certain elite, they also studied abroad. They went to Europe and just sort of pursued their studies from the Egyptian studios with Egyptian artists or artists established in Cairo to Europe, to Paris or Florence. And this was the case, for example, of another artist, which is a little bit less renowned than Inji Efflatoun, called Amy Nimr. And for those who have seen the exhibition, you will see this work, as well as another work from the same period. And she's also emblematic of that generation of artists, as Inji Efflatoun was. She was an Egyptian-born Syrian British artist, and she was raised in a very cosmopolitan environment. Her father, Faris Nimr, was actually the founder of a very important journal called Al-Muqattam. And her mother, Ellen Nimr, was herself a daughter of a British consul. So contrary to Inji, where it was maybe more, the education was more oriented towards Paris and France, in the Nimr family, it was rather looking towards Great Britain. And this is why she was actually educated, sent at the Slade School of Fine Art in London, where actually several artists, Egyptian artists, studied. And then she moved to Paris, where she frequented artists such as André Lotte. But she also met leading figures and was sort of close to leading figures of the avant-garde, which include Dali, Tanguy, and also Marcoussis. So you see, this is really a kind of training that is representative, alternative ways to receive a training in a society that doesn't give access to public education. And actually, she did not, I don't have many of her other works, but she painted very figurative, interesting works because she represented Jewish families, Egyptian Jewish families, which is a very rare topic at that time. Also portraits of Nubian women, women from Sudan. She's an extremely interesting figure and would deserve to be, I mean, her life and work would deserve much more researches. But what I wanted to say is that these works, she started really producing these surrealist works when she lost her son in a terrible, tragic accident. And from then on, she sort of stopped painting for a few years, and then she joined the Egyptian Surrealist group. And as you can see, her works from that period mainly represented corpses sort of tormented by death and by other living creatures or surrealist creatures, surreal creatures. So it's a very gloomy period. But then again, after that, it was also like Inji, sort of a short period in her life, and she returned to painting more figural subjects. So just getting back to this issue of women and art education, I think it's important to understand that certain Egyptian feminists had been claiming women's right to education and right to enter the School of Fine Arts in Cairo as early on as the 1920s. In particular, Hoda Sha'rawi, whom you see the portrait here, who founded the Egyptian Feminist Union in 1923, so quite early on in the actual global history of feminism, and who founded also this review, L'Égyptienne, with her colleague, Seizana Barawi. And this feminist review, which was, as you can read, about feminism, sociology, and art, which is a nice triangulation of subjects for a review, in the review, they repeatedly claimed access of women to education, but not only to the School of Fine Arts in Cairo, but also to just simply to public education and also higher education at the university. And it actually worked, but they had to sort of gain their cause, especially for the university, faculty after faculty. So, in a sense, Inji Efflatoun is a direct heir of those. She knew them very well. She also was founded with Seizana Barawi, who is one of the editors of L'Égyptienne, the youth committee of the Egyptian Feminist Union. So it's really a direct heritage, actually, from those personalities. So alongside other women of her generation, such as Doria Shafiq, which I showed you at the very beginning of my talk, Efflatoun founded the Association of Young Women of Universities and Institutes in 1944. And this association took the oath, as you can read on the slide, "We, the women of Egypt, solemnly declare to continuously fight until we eradicate backwardness and colonialism and establish real democracy in our country." So, yeah, she was a fervent activist, and she benefited also from the support of many male intellectuals, such as the novelist Taha Hussein, the writer Louis Awad, or the historian Abdelrahman El-Rafi. At the end of the 40s, she published feminist writings, including 80 Million Women with Us, which was introduced by Taha Hussein, who was not only already a very famous writer, but was also the dean of the university in Cairo. And she began to write also a column in a journal called Al-Masri, which was a leftist journal, under the title Women to Half the Society. But this is just to show you that she's, again, as she has been presented by scholars as a totally isolated case of this feminist activist, I just want to show you that actually she inscribes herself totally in the continuity of the history of feminism, of Egyptian feminism, which began actually in the 1920s. And the legacy of those feminists, such as Sharawi or Nabarawi, to Inji's career are not only political. These women, and that's another story, and I'd need another hour to talk about this, were very much into the revival of arts and crafts. So, in a sense, for them, their movement of emancipation and their anti-colonial sentiment was, in a sense, transposed on this safeguarding and revival of local arts and crafts. So they founded schools, they really encouraged crafts such as pottery, weaving, and this became a very important subject. And one can see it also with Inji Efflatoun, who throughout her career represented weavers and weavers on the loom. And this is not by mere chance, and it's not as simple as just wanting to represent something local. It goes farther than that. It's really about elevating a certain status of so-called minor arts to the status of major arts? Art majeur, yeah. And this combat was initiated, this struggle to preserve and revive arts and crafts was initiated by feminists, Egyptian feminists. So this is an early work from 1955, but you see that later on, this is her later works, 1971, the theme of the textile weaver on the loom, and this is also a representation of a textile weaver in Akhmim, which was renowned for its traditional carpets. So this is really a theme that was recurring in her production. I want to see how I am with time. Oh, fine. Okay. So besides this importance of reviving arts and crafts, these women had also participated in forging a sort of idealized image of the Egyptian peasant, which is called in Egypt the fellaha for a woman. Artists such as Mahmoud Mukhtar, of which you see a sculpture here, were financially supported by Egyptian feminists who believed also that the peasant represented a woman that was more emancipated because she worked and she earned her life and she sort of could deal with the money of the family, which was not the case of women from the elite. So Mukhtar, who is a major figure of Egyptian modern art, produced those iconic feminine figures of the Egyptian peasant. As here, this is called the Khamsin, which is a sandstorm that occurs every year in March, April in Egypt, and represented with the figure of a peasant. So there was also this idea, which was important in a certain anti-colonial political discourse, to reconnect Egyptian peasantry to ancient Egypt. So to create this sort of link with the glory of the let's say, glory of the Egyptian past. So painters such as Mahmoud, this is an example by Mahmoud Said, but there are many, many others. They had addressed this link between the peasant and the pharaoh by creating a somewhat stereotyped image and also a utopian rural world. And Inji Efflatoun also expressed this linkage between the Egyptian fellaha and ancient Egypt, as you can see in such works as her descendant of Hatshepsut. But maybe she distinguishes herself from her predecessors, as Mahmoud Said, that I just showed you, in the sense that her peasants, they are not anonymous masses in an idealized rural world. They are straightforward portraits depicting individuals with sort of their personal histories. This is maybe what would distinguish her from her contemporaries. Yeah. I also wanted to mention briefly the important link between Egyptian modern artists and the Mexican muralists. In February 1959, Inji Efflatoun held a solo exhibition at the Cairo Atelier, and she asked the Mexican artist David Alfaro Siqueiros to introduce the exhibition catalogue. And she had met him because he was in Egypt to visit Gamal Abdel Nasser. He came with his wife, Angelica Arenal, to meet Gamal Abdel Nasser to discuss the impact of the Bandung Conference on Latin America. And it's interesting in a sense that we find this link not only with Inji Efflatoun, but also with other Egyptian artists. This is just an abstract from this exhibition catalogue. You can see, I don't want to compare, but I mean, this is sort of contemporary of Siqueiros' visit, and we know that the exchanges with Mexican revolutionary artists were really important. And one can find a certain aesthetic in Inji's works from that period. And not only Inji Efflatoun, but just as an example, other artists who were very sort of in contact with the Mexican muralists, such as Hamed Owais, who is renowned really for his portraying of the Egyptian working class. So towards the end of the 50s, the themes of poverty and social injustice appear, in a sense, more and more clearly in Efflatoun's works. And such as you can see here in this sort of powerful and dramatic scene of a girl mourning her deceased mother, laying in, let's say, sort of blood, I don't know how to say this in English, mare de sang, entitled The Girl of Port Said. Just because I find it very interesting, and just to give you a little glimpse in this mapping, sort of transnational mapping of Egyptian modernism. So we have this link with Mexico, and of course you can imagine that at the time of Gamal Abdel Nasser there were other links with other non-aligned countries. So here is, for example, the cover page of an important artistic review called Sot El Fanan, The Voice of the Artist, which is illustrated by a work by Jamini Roy, who was a very important Indian modern artist. So you see those links with the India of Nehru, but there were many other links also because between Gamal Abdel Nasser and Tito, so there were links and exchanges cultural exchanges with Yugoslavia, for example. And this is a whole other mapping which is very interesting, and figures such as Inji Efflatoun are part of this sort of global mapping in the 50s in Egypt. So I'm gently coming to my conclusion. This is the final part where I just wanted to mention this imprisonment period. In March 1959, so this is 1 month after the exhibition where David Alfaro Siqueiros signed the catalogue, she was arrested due to her political activities. And because at the time, Nasser's regime was really clamping down on communist activists. So she was arrested alongside many others, and she was assigned to the women's prison of Al-Qanatir and then transferred to another prison called Abu Zabal, where she remained until her release on the 26th of July 1963. So she spent really 4 years in prison. So she was able to continue painting during her imprisonment because she had convinced the director of, that's in her memoirs, of the prison, to sell her works at his own cost. But she also managed to smuggle, thanks to the visits of her sister, some works out of the prison. And her sister would bring her the material and the brushes and the paint during also visiting hours. But what's interesting in the case of Inji Efflatoun is that her prison period, despite the difficulties, is actually, I think, a very positive period for her. The reality of prison life for her is really a very enriching experience because she suddenly finds intimacy with the people, and in that case, the women she had been observing from afar. Suddenly, the previous subjects of her paintings, the peasant, the worker, became part of her everyday life. So this social gap that she had resented so much seemed to sort of progressively blur in prison. And it also, I mean, it gave her the opportunity, in a sense, to experiment social injustice, against which she had been fighting. So she really produced many portraits of women prisoners, which are quite blunt, as you can see, and powerful. We are far from the joyful, colorful peasants that she painted during her time with Margot Veillon. Her women behind bars really bear an intense expression. And one of her inmates was called Inshira, was, for example, condemned to death, but given a year's suspension to breastfeed her newborn baby. And we have many portraits of that inmate. So she could really record the personal histories of her fellow inmates. And at the same time, these individuals were part of a collective narrative. And her period of imprisonment was both a period of introspection, but also the rediscovery of new worlds. However, towards the end of her incarceration, the personal mythologies of women prisoners progressively made place to sort of longing for freedom, and she started to paint a tree that she could see from her window in different seasons. And this series of trees, which her fellow inmates called Inji's Tree of Freedom, express a certain sense of resignation and serenity. And in a sense, they announce her post-incarceration period, of which you see here an example, which is also referred to as her white period, and which is characterized by the rhythm of pure brushstrokes playing with the blanks of the canvas. So this work really reflects the new ethereal way of playing with void and texture of her very late period. Could be considered as an expression of rebirth and regained freedom. And also this manner of addressing her surroundings operates a certain distance from reality. These bold color strokes that contrast with pure blankness also remind us of a woven carpet Inji may have recreated from the loom of her imagination during her captivity, and it attests to a certain maturity in rediscovering the outside world with a new breath. So, as a conclusion, I'd say that Inji Efflatoun's artistic career implies, as I try to show, a constant reflection about her society and the role she could play in contributing to its change. Her work is also a tribute to the Egyptian people, with whom she constantly tried to interact and to overcome sort of social classes differences. She tried to give a voice to those who had been instrumental in creating the image of an independent nation without ever being a part of the political sphere, whether it was the fellaha, the worker, or the prisoner. I think I have another image, last image. So her painting, though, goes far beyond an actual political discourse, in my view, as it constantly re-explores the identities of her contemporaries as well as her own in order to reflect the nuances of a change in Egyptian society to which her, let's say, her contemporaries, the Egyptian new women, also very much contributed to. So I thank you for your attention and would be glad to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much.
Even in German, auf Deutsch.
Yeah, first I will say in English, thank you very much for your tour d'horizon in a way, because for us it was, I can say us because my colleague Peter Schüller and myself, who worked on that exhibition here, we found when we saw the exhibition in Paris that there are so many new names to us, and then we found our way a little bit in the biographies, and which was not always easy to find. And we thought if you have the material of the Liberté show, you could also have chosen to make another composition or a constellation of the artists, for example, to put all the images of, let's say, Inji Efflatoun together, which is not the case. We have, as you have seen, maybe the exhibition, this is, the structure is differently, it's in different chapters, and so it's not so easy to get in a contact to these single individuals with which they are. In fact, even they are members maybe of a group, and we know that Inji was a very young woman when she joined the group, and so for me now it really was very, very interesting to follow her way a little bit, and I also found it's very interesting to know about this Mexican connection, because this revolutionary art approach they have, it makes sense that then in the 50s when the non-aligned states are getting together. And so this is really very interesting. So I would like to ask just something on the fact of the life of Inji Efflatoun when she, after 1963, when she was not any longer in prison, she lived in Cairo the whole time. So she was always, she could work there and could also exhibit there.
Yeah.
Was she very estimated in these years. Then the 70s are.
Well, interestingly, she actually continued to exhibit when in prison.
Mm-hmm.
Her works were actually Gulperi took some works and showed them in the Cairo Art Salon. Yeah. So she was renowned, and then this is her in her atelier. I guess it's, I would say, towards the end of the 60s, 70s, in the neighborhood of Zamalek, which is a very cosmopolitan neighborhood in Cairo. And I think she had no problem exhibiting, because I know she also had very close ties with some important gallerists in Cairo who are still there and who still possess a lot of her works. Yeah.
If I can add another question before, and then I also would like to have you included. What I found also very interesting is all the iconography of the peasants and the rural scenes, because we have this in the exhibition a lot, and I have to say that we cannot always decipher the motifs and the different scenes or so, and it would be interesting to go with you through the exhibition. Maybe you really could help us to understand the birds and the fishes, and then sometime we have a tree which looks like a hippie hair head plant or so. This is something we could see in the 50s as a sign for this new Republican Egyptian.
Yeah, I think, I mean, the theme of peasantry is it's a major theme, and it's been, which adapted throughout. I mean, from the 20s still now. It's actually still now some contemporary artists are focusing on Egyptian peasantry, and it's been a theme also in a sense of social justice towards the 50s, because this is when intellectuals were fighting for an agrarian reform, because literally the Egyptian peasants were the poorest, but also the most important in number of the Egyptian society. And so this agrarian reform under Nasser was supposed to redistribute the land. And this, of course, was a big concern for artists, for intellectuals, even though it didn't happen the way it should have. There was a lot of utopia. There were a lot of modern Egyptian architects who rethink the peasant village. Hassan Fathi is a very renowned one of them, but there were many other modernists who sort of start designing the peasant house, designing entire villages. So it's a very important movement towards the end of the 40s, beginning of the 50s, which sort of happens in the larger context of the agrarian reform.
And this has certainly also to do with the long history of Egypt and the land and what all happened, everything there. This I learned a little bit from Wael Showi, who also has some of his films are playing in the rural countryside of Egypt, and which is so kind of scary even. There are so many mysterious things going on, and secrets and hidden sheikhs and jinns, and I don't know. So,
true.
Yeah. Okay. Gibt es Fragen hier aus dem Publikum? Wir haben ein kleines Ründchen und haben einen tollen Gast hier, glaube ich, der uns viel erzählen kann, weil ich glaube, auch dieses ganze Thema Feminismus ist super interessant eigentlich für uns zu sehen, dass eine in den 20er Jahren aktive Feministin ist, aber dann verschleiert. Das fand ich auch interessant. Dann die andere Dame, 1952 von Van Leo, die sieht ganz westlich aus.
Maybe I can just add about this, the veil. that Hoda Sha'rawi, whom I showed to you, this was very important gesture. She was, women from the elite were actually veiled with a little, totally, like with the little white veil. And she, coming back from a feminist conference in Rome, the Feminist Congress in Rome, unveiled with her colleague Cezanne Bahraoui publicly at Cairo station. And this was one of the most sort of marking acts of the feminists, the Egyptian Feminist Union, when they did this. Yeah.
Were there many other women that went to jail that she was like involved with? Did they all go to the same jail? Was there like a community of artists who were imprisoned there, or was it just her?
No, there were many, and intellectuals and writers, but also a lot of people from the working class who hadn't. This is the people she wanted to interact with and that she represented. But actually, there were other sort of people from the sort of intellectual circles, and there were 2 women prison. And they were quite full.
Yeah. And was it generally for those 4 years that most people were imprisoned? Was that like a normal?
No, I think she was lucky. I think 4 years was a bit short, and I think that there was a lot of. I mean, she probably had some. I don't know about how she got out, but I could imagine that there'd be some support from the outside for her.
Maybe one more questions about relations and about the salons, because I was also thinking, I mean, as far as I am informed, there are only Ami Nimr and Mahmoud Said that were also exhibited at the salons, at the Salon du Caire. But you just mentioned that Inji Efflatoun also had exhibitions or were shown there maybe later.
Yes.
But it's also like for, especially maybe for Mahmoud Said, it's more understandable from his style. But for Ami Nimr, it's like, I can't really explain it. Do you have like, or is it more maybe story of having the right relations, or I don't know.
From my knowledge of the salon, it was very broad, like open to literally anyone who painted in Cairo could enter the salon.
Okay. But how can you explain that? Like the other artists of the Liberté group didn't want to show there?
No, they didn't want to. Because the salon, now I understand better your question. The salon was led by a political personality called, maybe you know, Mohammed Mahmoud Khalil, who was a politician, a senator, but also a collector. And he had his hand on the Cairo Art Salon for almost 30 years. And he also organized a lot. He liked French art. This was really his thing. And he invited a lot of sort of European artists established in Cairo to participate in the Salon. And in the Salon, there was a little bit of everything. There were amateurs, there were a lot of European artists from all over the world, I mean Greek artists from Sweden, Switzerland, and so on, and the Egyptian artists. But I think the Art et Liberté could not, no, and it's logic. I mean, if you know sort of the movement, that they could not present in the Salon, and what they created, in a sense, is a kind of Salon des Indépendants. I mean, if one should compare it. I don't know if this answers.
And I mean, we also have in the exhibition one example for another separation. It's that of the Gruppe de l'Art Contemporain, who were always told us to be the real modern artists in Egypt, and had they also participated then in the Salon du Caire?
No, I think they participated mostly in the biennales, but they were, no, because one of the artists, Abdelhadi El-Ghazar, was actually very strongly, he was also imprisoned, actually. So, no. But they did participate in the Alexandria Biennale. Egypt has always been a bit, let's say, paradoxical in censorship. There has always been a sort of a strong censorship, but at the same time some kind of lenient, like you can be censored, but you can also publish. It's, I wouldn't know how to explain it, but for me it's something very particular that has to do with censorship in Egypt.
Okay, gibt es noch Fragen, Anmerkungen? Wenn nicht, dann verlegen wir das vielleicht nach oben noch bei einem Drink. Vielen Dank. Thank you very much, Nadia.
Vielen Dank.
It's really very interesting.